She was only 7 years old when the world around her began to cheer for a man she did not understand. Flags waved, drums beat, and adults raised their arms in perfect unison. But behind the closed doors of her home, her mother cried at night and whispered words that could never be spoken aloud. This isn't a story of generals or grand battles. This is the story of a child in Hitler's Germany, whose innocence was tested by fear, hunger, lies, and war, and how what she saw would stay with her for the rest of her life. They told her she was lucky to be born in a new Germany, but no one explained why her best friend suddenly disappeared, or why her father stopped laughing, or why the very air in their small town felt heavy with secrets. She was born in the early 1930s, in a place where cobblestone streets echoed with marching boots and radios crackled with powerful voices promising a glorious future. To her, Germany was simply home. It was the smell of fresh bread in the mornings, the sound of church bells on Sunday, and the comfort of her mother's hand holding hers tightly as they walked through the market square. But slowly, quietly, that world began to change. At school, she learned new songs before she even learned multiplication. Songs about loyalty, strength, and a leader who was said to love children like her more than anyone. Her teacher's voice grew sharp and cold whenever someone hesitated to sing along. Pictures of smiling boys and girls in crisp uniforms covered the classroom walls, and she was told, over and over, that obedience was the highest virtue. She just wanted to be good. She wanted her teacher to smile at her, so she sang the songs. She raised her hand to answer questions. She repeated words she did not fully understand, because that's what good children did. At home, however, the atmosphere was completely different. Her father would lower his voice whenever the radio was on, his eyes darting towards the windows. He'd turn it off suddenly if he heard footsteps passing by outside. Her mother started hiding books behind loose floorboards in the bedroom, and warned her never to repeat conversations she might overhear. One evening, she heard her parents arguing in whispers so intense they sounded like desperate prayers. She caught fragments of words: Jews, arrests, camp. She didn't know what they meant, but she knew, from the terror in their voices, that they were dangerous. Then one day, her friend Ruth did not come to school. Ruth, who had always shared her apple, who laughed so easily, and who once braided her hair during recess. The teacher announced simply that Ruth's family had moved away. But her desk stayed empty, a silent reminder in the middle of the classroom, and no one ever said her name again. When the child asked her mother where Ruth had gone, her mother hugged her so tightly it hurt, and said, "Sometimes people are taken by the storm." That was the first time the child realized that silence wasn't just emptiness. It was a form of survival. As the years passed, uniforms began to replace ordinary clothes. Organized youth groups replaced free play in the fields. Her older brother was told he would become a hero for the fatherland. He marched proudly at first, his uniform immaculate, his chin held high. But when he came home on leave, his eyes looked older than their father's. He spoke less, ate less. He would stare at the wall for hours. One night, she heard him crying in his room, not like a soldier, but like a lost little boy. Fear became as normal as breathing. Then hunger followed. By the time the war arrived in full force, the sound of bombs was no longer a surprise. It was a routine. Sirens tore through the night, and she learned how to grab her shoes and a coat without fully waking up. Down in the damp, crowded air raid shelters, surrounded by the quiet breathing of strangers in the dark, she would clutch her mother's coat and wonder if the world above ground would still exist when the all-clear siren finally sounded. Through it all, a small part of her still believed that the adults knew what they were doing, that this chaos had a purpose, that the promises she had been taught in school would eventually come true. She did not yet understand that childhood under a dictatorship is not protected, it is consumed. The propaganda was relentless. Posters showed strong, blonde-haired families smiling under the sun, while newspapers screamed about enemies at the borders and traitors within. The reality was ration cards, the taste of ersatz coffee made from acorns, and the constant gnawing anxiety in her stomach that wasn't just from hunger. One afternoon, the Gestapo came for their neighbor, Herr Schmidt, the quiet old man who fixed clocks. She watched from her window as two men in long leather coats led him away. He didn't struggle. He just looked tired. His wife stood on the doorstep, her face a mask of stone, until the car turned the corner. Then she collapsed. The child's mother pulled her away from the window, her hands shaking. "You saw nothing," she whispered. "Remember, you saw nothing." The lesson was clear. To see was to be in danger. To know was a liability. The safest thing was to be blind and ignorant. But a child's mind can't unsee. She started noticing the small acts of defiance. A baker slipping an extra roll into her mother's bag when no one was looking. An old woman leaving a small bowl of milk on the doorstep for the stray cats that everyone else ignored. These tiny moments of humanity felt like flickering candles in a vast, encroaching darkness. They were glimmers of the world she remembered, the one with laughter and shared apples. As the war neared its end, the fabric of her town and of Germany itself completely unraveled. The charismatic voice on the radio was now frantic, promising miracle weapons and a final, glorious victory. But outside, the reality was defeat. Wounded soldiers, no older than her brother, limped through the streets. The confident marching boots had been replaced by the shuffling feet of refugees. The air, once filled with patriotic songs, was now filled with the constant drone of eyed bombers. One day, the sirens didn't stop. The bombing was heavier than ever before. Her family's apartment building shook, and the world became a storm of dust, noise, and screaming. When the shaking finally subsided, they emerged from the cellar into a landscape she didn't recognize. Their street was gone. In its place were craters and skeletons of buildings, black against a smoke-filled sky. Home was now a pile of rubble. In the final days, foreign soldiers rolled into their town. They looked nothing like the monsters from the propaganda posters. They were just men, tired and young, who handed out chocolate and chewing gum. For the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid of a uniform. It was a strange, disorienting feeling. The war was over. The cheering had stopped. The flags were gone. All that was left was silence and ruin. Years later, as an old woman, she would try to explain what it was like. It wasn't the bombs or the hunger she remembered most vividly. It was the quiet moments, the empty desk, the whispered arguments, the fear in her mother's eyes. It was the slow poisoning of her childhood, the way lies were dressed up as truth, and how easily people could be taught to hate. She learned that the greatest atrocities don't always begin with a bang. They begin with whispers, with looking away, and with the silence of good people who are too afraid to speak. Her story is a reminder that innocence, once lost to the machinery of ideology, can never be fully reclaimed. It leaves a shadow that lasts a lifetime. The day the bombs destroyed her street, she understood something no child should ever have to learn. The lies were louder than the truth, but the truth always survives. This isn't just a story from a history book. This is the story of a girl, a child growing up in Hitler's Germany, and a world that was built and then shattered around her. For years, her childhood was a carefully constructed illusion. Parades filled the streets, flags waved from every window, and songs of national pride were sung in her classroom. She was taught that Germany was strong, righteous, and destined for greatness. The enemy was a caricature, a monster to be feared and hated. She believed it. How could she not? Every adult, every teacher, every radio broadcast told her the same story. It was a world of black and white, good and evil, us and them. And she was on the right side. But then the war turned. The illusion began to crack. The triumphant broadcasts on the radio could hide the wail of air raid sirens that now sliced through the night. The cities that were once symbols of German strength began to burn. Smoke stained the sky for days, a constant, grim reminder that the war was no longer happening somewhere else. It was here. Refugees started to appear, their faces gaunt, their eyes holding a haunted look she didn't understand. They filled the roads, pushing carts piled high with the few possessions they could save. Her town, once neat and orderly, became a place of broken windows and empty houses. Friends and neighbors disappeared overnight. No one said where they went. It was a question you learned not to ask. Her school closed, then reopened as a makeshift shelter for those who had lost their homes. The lessons stopped. The songs faded. Then it closed again, this time for good. The hallways that once echoed with children's laughter fell silent. Food became a memory. The ache of hunger was a constant companion. She learned how to stretch a thin soup with water, making it last just one more day. She learned to chew each bite slowly, trying to trick her stomach into feeling full. She learned how to ignore the gnawing emptiness inside her so that her younger sister could have her share. Hunger teaches you a different kind of math, a desperate calculus of survival. Her father never came back from the front. One day, the letters just stopped. There was no official notice, no grave to visit, no final goodbye. Just a sudden, gaping absence at the dinner table. An empty chair that screamed louder than any bomb. She watched her mother age years in just a few months. Her shoulders grew bent, weighed down by a grief she had no time or space to process. There was no room for sorrow when survival demanded every ounce of your energy. And so, the child became something else. Not quite an adult, but no longer just a child. She existed in a gray space in between, forced to grow up far too fast. Survival became her new education. She learned how to barter a worn-out pair of shoes for a handful of potatoes. She learned to scavenge in the rubble of bombed-out buildings, looking for anything useful, anything that could be traded. She learned to read the faces of strangers, to see the flicker of danger or desperation in their eyes. She built walls around her heart, because caring was a luxury she couldn't afford. Then, one day, the war ended. The Allied soldiers arrived. She had been taught her whole life that these men were monsters, inhuman beasts who would bring destruction and terror. So when she saw them, fear coiled in her stomach. But the soldiers she saw weren't monsters. They were just men. They looked tired, their uniforms covered in dust, their faces etched with the same weariness she saw in everyone around her. One of them, seeing her watching from a doorway, smiled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in paper. He held it out to her. It was a piece of chocolate. She stared at it, then at him. In that moment, she didn't know what to do. Should she run? Should she cry? This simple, small act of kindness was more confusing than all the bombs and all the hunger. It was a crack in the foundation of everything she had been taught. If this was the enemy, then what else was a lie? After the surrender, the truth began to seep out, slowly, painfully, like water from a cracked dam. The whispers that had been spoken in hushed tones behind closed doors turned into public testimonies. The empty homes in her neighborhood finally gained explanations. The camps, once just names on a map, gained a horrifying reality. She learned what had happened to her friend Ruth, the girl with the bright ribbons in her hair who had simply vanished one day. She learned the true meaning of words she had heard but never understood. Genocide, murder, atrocity. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. It felt like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She had been a part of it. She had waved the flags. She had sung the songs. She had believed the lies. She realized that she, too, had been a tool, her innocence and ignorance shaped by fear and propaganda into a weapon of passive consent. The guilt was immense. But alongside the guilt, something else awakened. A cold, hard anger. Anger at being lied to. Anger at being used. And with that anger came a profound sense of responsibility. A responsibility to remember. Not just the story she had been told, but the real story, the ugly, painful, and complicated truth. As Germany began to rebuild itself from the literal rubble, she carried invisible ruins inside her. The memories, the guilt, the lost innocence. But she also carried a newfound resolve. Years later, when she had children of her own, she would tell them the truth. Not the propaganda, not the excuses, not the comfortable silence that so many people chose. She would tell them the whole story. She would teach them that love for your country must never, ever be blind. That obedience without a conscience is one of the most dangerous things in the world. She would teach them that hatred and evil don't always begin with a bang. They often start with small steps, with quiet approval, with looking the other way. She survived. Not because she was uniquely strong or brave, but because she endured. Because even as a child, surrounded by a universe of lies, a tiny voice somewhere deep inside her had whispered that something was wrong. And she never completely silenced that voice. She was a child in Hitler's Germany, and what she saw taught her a lifelong lesson the world still struggles to learn. Evil does not always arrive screaming and brandishing weapons. It often arrives singing patriotic songs, waving bright flags, and asking children to repeat words they don't yet understand. Her story is not just a piece of history. It is a warning. It is a mirror. And as long as we remember it, as long as we tell it, her childhood and the childhoods of millions like her were not lost in vain. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it. The more we remember, the safer our future becomes. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter.